Picture this. It's May 1945, and you are standing on the wide flight deck of the USS Enterprise, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The air boss has just launched 30 Hellcats and Dauntless dive bombers for a strike on Japanese positions far away. They'll be back in 2 hours, running low on fuel, some damaged, their tired pilots barely holding on. And here's the big problem that's about to kill some of them if things go wrong. Your flight deck is an 872-foot-long floating parking lot with only one way in and one way out. Every aircraft carrier in World War II worked like a dangerous game of musical chairs. When planes returned from their missions, they had to land one at a time on the back end, catch an arresting wire, and then quickly taxi forward to park near the front. Sounds simple, right? Except each landing took about 90 seconds, and you had 30 planes circling overhead with maybe 20 minutes of fuel left. It must. Do the math. That's 45 minutes of recovery time for 30 aircraft. The last planes in the pattern were landing almost on fumes. And if one pilot missed the wires and crashed, everything stopped cold. The deck crew had to shove the wreckage overboard while 29 other pilots kept burning fuel, circling helplessly in the sky and watching their gauges fall toward empty. But the real nightmare wasn't just the recovery time. It was what happened right after. Once all your planes were safely back aboard, they sat parked wingtip to wingtip from front to back, fully armed and fueled. The flight deck looked like a crowded parking garage filled with bombs and aviation gas waiting for disaster. Want to launch another strike? You couldn't. Not until deck crews manually pushed and pulled every single aircraft around, respawning them for launch, which took another hour or more. The carrier became basically useless for 60 to 90 minutes after taking aircraft back on board. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding a Task Force 58 in 1944, called this the deck cycle problem, and it was choking American naval air power. His carriers could theoretically operate 100 aircraft each, but the straight deck design meant he could only launch one major strike per day. The Japanese faced the same terrible problem. Their carriers at Midway in June 1942 were caught with planes parked everywhere, unable to launch or land when American dive bombers arrived. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu all went down because their decks were frozen, trapped in the recovery, respot, and rearm cycle with no escape. Here's what really kept the admirals awake at night. Carriers were supposed to be the new capital ships, replacing battleships as the backbone of naval power. But battleships could fire their guns all day without stopping. A carrier launching one strike every 6 hours was not really a weapon. It was a very expensive sitting duck. The U.S. Navy figured out that in a possible battle against the Soviet Navy in the late 1940s, American carriers would only get one strike before enemy submarines and surface ships got close. One punch, and then you were in a knife fight with an empty gun. The straight deck design wasn't anyone's mistake. It was just how every Navy had built carriers since the 1920s. You needed one long runway pointing into the wind for takeoff and landing. And nobody questioned that idea until pilots started dying from running out of fuel waiting to land. December 7, 1941 changed everything about how navies thought about carriers, but not the way most people remember. Yes, Pearl Harbor showed carriers could hit hard. Japanese aircraft wrecked the Pacific Fleet in 2 hours. But what happened next showed the real problem. Admiral Nagumo's 6 carriers launched 353 planes in 2 waves. Starting at 6 a.m. by 10 a.m., his decks were packed with planes coming back, and he couldn't launch a third strike on Pearl's oil tanks. And repair yards, his crews needed 3 hours to clear the decks, rearm and respot. And those 3 hours would have left him open to attack if any U.S. carriers had been nearby. So Nagumo turned home, leaving his mission unfinished because his decks had become parking lots. The Americans learned the same lesson 6 months later at Midway. On June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers Akagi Kaga and Soryu were caught with their decks full, some planes being armed for land strikes, others rearmed for sea strikes, refueling zeros. The deck cycle froze them for 47 minutes. That's when Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise appeared. 3 carriers lost in 5 minutes because they couldn't even launch their planes. The straight deck had turned them into floating bombs. They were tracking something called deck cycle efficiency, which basically meant how long a carrier stayed useless between strikes, and the numbers were awful. USS Yorktown's air group recorded an average of 93 minutes from last landing to next launch during the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942. Saratoga took 108 minutes during the Santa Cruz battle in October. The Japanese did even worse. Shikaku needed 2 hours and 14 minutes to turn her deck around after recovering planes at the Eastern Solomons. Every admiral in the Pacific could see what was wrong. Carriers were spending more time moving planes around than actually fighting Enterprise. Air Group Commander Wade McCluskey, the same guy who sank 3 carriers at Midway, wrote a secret memo in January 1943 saying we're built for one-punch fights, but we're in a 15-round boxing match. He figured that if Japanese and American carriers met in open ocean, the side that launched first would win because the other side would still be busy landing its planes. Naval battles had turned into quick draw fights where the fastest gun won by mid-1943. The U.S. Navy had enough new Essex-class carriers that they could rotate them, some launching, some landing, some rearming. It worked, sort of, but it meant you needed 3 carriers to do the job. One should have done. Commander Joseph Clifton on Lexington in 1944 wrote in his log that during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, American carriers launched 226 planes but needed 97 minutes to recover them. 5 pilots ditched after running out of fuel waiting for deck space. This couldn't go on. Something had to change because the Navy was building bigger, faster carriers that could carry 80, then 90, then 100 planes. But if you couldn't even use them all because your deck design was still from 1925, what was the point while American carriers fought in the Pacific? The Royal Navy was quietly fixing the deck cycle problem in the Atlantic, and no one was watching. British carriers had a different nightmare than the Americans. Their flight decks were smaller, their hangars more cramped, and they operated in the North Atlantic, where bad weather could stop flying for days. Captain Matthew Slattery on HMS Illustrious realized in early 1943 that his ship could never match American carrier efficiency using normal straight deck methods, so he tried something that sounded crazy. What if planes could land while other planes were still parked on deck? The first tests in March 1943 were rough. Slattery had his crew paint a white line down the left side of the deck, making a narrow landing strip. Beside the parked planes, pilots came in from the back, caught the arresting wires on this offset path, then taxied into position. It worked once before a Seafire came in too far right and hit a parked Swordfish back to planning again, but Slattery had proved something important. You didn't need the whole deck width for. Landing planes could maybe touch down on one side while another side did something else. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected person. Dennis Campbell, a civilian physicist working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment in late 1943. He was studying carrier efficiency for the Admiralty when he saw everyone was thinking about it wrong. Carriers treated the deck like a one-lane road, one direction, one line of traffic. But what if you thought of it like a train yard trains can cross? If tracks meet at an angle, apply that to a carrier deck. And if you angled the landing area away from the launch area, you could do both at once. Campbell's idea, in January 1944, suggested cutting the back of the flight deck at a 5-degree angle to the left. Planes would land on that slanted part, catch the wires, then taxi off to the left side park, while planes parked on the right front could take off without waiting. The Admiralty was doubtful. Changing every carrier's main layout based on one physicist's drawing seemed risky, but they agreed to test it on HMS Triumph, a small carrier working in the Indian Ocean, where fighting was less heavy. Commander H.P. Bramwell handled the changes in Colombo Harbor. In August 1944, workers painted a slanted landing line on Triumph's deck. No metal changes, just paint and new wire spots, the first pilot. Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown later said that landing on the angled deck felt completely wrong, like the ship was turning under him. But it worked. Brown landed, turned left, and cleared the area in 45 seconds, while a Corsair took off from the bow. Both jobs done at once, no delay. The Royal Navy quietly tried angled deck landings through late 1944 and 1945. The results were amazing but not perfect. The 5-degree angle helped, but it wasn't enough to truly split landing, and takeoff planes still had to move through tight spaces. The war ended before the British could improve the idea, and with Japan beaten, nobody cared much about carrier changes anymore. The notes sat in Admiralty files gathering dust. While the world went back to peace, the answer was proven, but forgotten. Then came Commander Walter Boone, a U.S. Navy test pilot, who in 1951 was tired of hearing that jets would end carrier use. The new F-9 FMM NIAF Panthers and F-2H Banshees were faster and heavier than old planes, so they needed more deck room and had less extra fuel. Every flight expert said the same thing: jets and straight-D decks couldn't mix. The Navy would have to build new ships or give up carriers. Boone thought that was foolish. He read the British reports about HMS Triumph's angled deck tests, since almost nobody else had, and saw what they missed. The 5-degree angle was too small. You needed to turn the landing strip 8 to 10 degrees, so a pilot who missed all the wires could speed up and fly off again without crashing. The British had thought about traffic, but Boone thought about how to stop disaster. At 8 to 10 degrees, a missed landing could just take off again. No crash, no wreck, cleanup, no planes waiting in the sky, wasting fuel. And in March 1951, Boone explained his idea to Rear Admiral Apollo Soucek at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland. Soucek basically said, "Prove it." So Boone and his team used USS Midway while she was in Norfolk for normal upkeep. They painted an angled landing zone on her deck, 8 degrees to the left side, and moved the arresting gear. The change was simple but huge. It made 2 runways on one ship, a straight path from bow to stern for takeoff, and a slanted strip from stern to the left middle for landing. For the first time ever, a carrier could land and launch at the same time. The first test was in July 1951. Boone flew the first try in an F-9F Panther, coming in at 145 knots toward what looked like a moving deck. He caught the third wire perfect landing, turned left, and parked while he was still rolling. Another Panther took off from the bow catapult. 30 seconds later, a third Panther landed on the angled deck. Then another takeoff, another landing, non-stop motion. What once took 90 minutes now flowed in 18. The crew logged 12 landings and 12 takeoffs. In those 18 minutes, that same job on a straight deck would take over an hour. But the real proof came when Boone missed the wires on purpose during the 7th try on a normal deck. That would mean a crash into parked planes and people. But on the angled deck, Boone just sped up, lifted off, and flew away safely. The deck crew didn't even blink. He circled back and landed perfectly. Next time, Soucek, watching from the control island, instantly saw the truth. The angled deck didn't just make things faster. It removed the most dangerous risk in carrier flying. The July tests proved the angle worked. The August tests showed it worked for many plane types. By September 1951, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics was already planning to change every carrier in the fleet. One pilot and a paint job had just doubled. America's sea air power, proving it worked on Midway's painted deck, was one thing. Rebuilding carriers to make the new angled decks permanent turned into a huge engineering nightmare that lasted 3 years, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and forced the Navy to rethink everything they thought they knew about carrier design. The issue wasn't only cutting the deck at an angle, because every system on those ships had been built for straight deck geometry for over 30 years. Changing one thing meant changing everything. First came the island structure. On straight deck carriers, the island sat on the right side about midship, which worked fine when the landing area ran straight down the center line. But with the new 8-degree angled deck, incoming planes were now flying directly toward the island before catching the wires. The approach path crossed right where the island stood. Designers at the New York Naval Shipyard spent 6 months in late 1951 trying to figure out if they could move it, shrink it, or somehow make it invisible to landing planes. The answer was compromise. They moved the island a little back and added a wider deck section on the left side to fit the angled landing area. That meant cutting into the hull and adding strong support frames. Each ship would spend about 4 months in dry dock for that one change. Next came the arresting gear problem. The systems that stopped planes were built straight across the ship's middle line with all the hydraulic parts set under the deck. Angling them by 8 degrees meant completely redesigning the gear, moving all the pipes and rebuilding the lower deck areas that held the equipment. Grumman engineer Robert Decker figured out that each carrier refit would need removing and replacing almost 40% of the arresting setup. The work on USS Antietam in 1952 took about 11,000 man-hours just for that. Then came the catapult problem, which luckily turned into an advantage. The Navy had been testing new steam catapults much stronger than the old ones, and this refit gave them the perfect reason to add them. Commander C. Kirkpatrick, leading the Antietam project, realized that steam catapults at the bow with angled landings meant the ships could launch and recover heavier planes at the same time. But installing them required cutting deck plates, running new steam pipes from the boilers, and building big machinery rooms under the flight deck. What began as a simple deck angle project quickly turned into a full flight deck. Rebuild. The mirror landing system, an optical device meant to guide pilots onto the angled deck, brought its own problems. The British had invented it in 1952, using a gyro-stabilized mirror and a set of lights to show pilots their correct glide path. Installing it on U.S. carriers meant aligning it perfectly with the new 8-degree deck angle and placing it where pilots could clearly see it during their offset landings. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander J.R. Lamb crashed twice in early tests because the mirror position gave wrong glide slope signals. Engineers had to move and recalibrate it 3 separate times before it finally worked. Between 1952 and 1955, the Navy rebuilt 13 Essex-class carriers with angled decks. Each conversion cost between $8 and $12 million, a huge amount. Considering the ships had cost $70 million new, USS Bennington entered Norfolk Naval Shipyard in January 1954 and did not leave until September. USS Hornet's refit took 7 months. These were not small upgrades. Workers were cutting large parts of the original decks, welding new structures and rerouting almost every major system. The ships that emerged were basically new, even though from far away they looked nearly the same. USS Antietam left Norfolk in December 1952 as the world's first angled deck carrier, ready to prove in Korea whether Captain Boone's design would succeed in battle or fail under fire. The Navy's leaders were deeply divided. Half believed angled decks were the future of carrier aviation. The other half feared it was a costly mistake that would only kill more pilots. Antietam had 4 months to prove who was right. The ship reached the Korean coast in January 1953 and began launching strikes against North Korean and Chinese targets, Commander William Sisko. The air boss kept careful records, knowing every number would be studied in Washington. During the first week, they established base performance. Antietam launched and safely recovered 68 combat missions in a 12-hour day, which didn't sound amazing until you compared it with her sister ship, USS Kearsarge, working on a straight deck just 50 miles south, which managed only 39 sorties in the same time. Both ships had the same size air groups, the same aircraft, and the same missions. Yet the angled deck carrier was producing 74% more combat power from an identical ship. The biggest improvement came in something pilots called deck availability, which meant how often the deck was clear and ready to receive aircraft. Straight deck carriers in Korea averaged only 42% availability, so pilots taking off for missions knew they had about a 50-50 chance the deck would be ready when they came back. If not, they would circle burning fuel or divert to airfields in South Korea. On Antietam, with its angled deck, that number jumped to 79%, which meant pilots could almost always come home safely. It may sound like simple math until you are the one in the cockpit staring at a low fuel gauge. Lieutenant James Meichner, later the famous author, was flying F-9F Panthers off Antietam in February 1953 when he saw the angled deck save 3 lives in one afternoon. A Sky Raider returning from a strike took battle damage, came in too hot, and missed all 4 arresting wires. On a straight deck, he would have smashed into parked planes, killing himself and others. On the angled deck, he simply flew off the port side, climbed dumped fuel, and landed clean on the next pass. Later that same day, another F-9F came in with a live bomb that had failed to drop. On a straight deck, it would have been too risky to let him land. But on the angled deck, they waved him straight in safely because the landing path was clear. A third pilot suffering from spatial disorientation touched down way off center, almost on the deck edge. On a straight deck, he would have hit the island. On the angled deck, his line was close enough to normal, and he caught a wire. By March 1953, Sisko's records showed Antietam flying 89 missions per day, compared to 47 from straight deck ships. The Navy sent Captain John Crommelin to watch and report. His message to the Chief of Naval Operations was short. Angled deck increases striking power by at least 85%. Every carrier not modified was operating at half capacity. The Navy recommended emergency conversion of all fleet carriers immediately. Skeptics in Washington went silent. What convinced everyone was a single metric the Navy began tracking in April. Mission effectiveness cycles measured how many complete strike recovery, rearm, and relaunch cycles a carrier could perform in 24 hours. Straight deck carriers averaged only 2.3 cycles. Antietam was logging 4.1 cycles. She was effectively 2 carriers in one. The geometry Boone had proven with paint in 1951 was now confirmed under fire. In 1953, Combat results from Korea ended the debate. By late 1953, the Navy committed to more than retrofitting old ships. They began designing a completely new class built from the keel up around angled deck operations. The Forrestal-class supercarriers would be the first warships where the angled deck was a core design feature, not an afterthought. Everything else, propulsion armor, weapons crew, quarters, was engineered to maximize the advantages of that 8-degree angle. USS Forrestal launched in December 1954. The difference was visible from the pier. The angled landing area was integrated into the hull with reinforced deck plating rated for jet impacts. The island sat farther aft than previous carriers, giving pilots a clear approach. 4 steam catapults, 2 on the bow and 2 on the angled waist deck, allowed Forrestal to launch 4 aircraft every 60 seconds while simultaneously recovering aircraft. The theoretical maximum sortie rate was 170 per day. No World War II carrier had exceeded 90. Captain Roy Johnson ran shakedown operations in 1955, and the ship validated every design decision. During one test off the Virginia Capes in August, the Air Wing launched a 40-plane strike, recovered 32 aircraft from the previous mission, and launched another 20-plane combat air patrol, all within 47 minutes. The deck crew conducted 3 separate operations simultaneously: catapult launches from the bow, arrested recoveries on the angled deck, and aircraft towing and fueling in the forward deck part. It was controlled chaos that worked because the geometry kept everything separate. The strategic impact hit the Soviet Union like a hammer. Their naval planners assumed American carriers were vulnerable during flight operations. Catch them while launching or recovering, and you could overwhelm them. The angled deck Forrestal-class carriers destroyed that assumption. These carriers were never truly vulnerable because they never truly stopped. Soviet Admiral Sergei Gorshkov wrote in a 1956 assessment that NATO carrier groups built around Forrestal-class ships could maintain continuous strike capability. Against Soviet positions, his conclusion was bleak. The Soviet surface Navy had no effective counter to supercarriers that could launch 100 combat sorties per day indefinitely. Numbers confirmed Gorshkov's fears. By 1959, the Navy had 4 Forrestal-class carriers: operational Forrestal, Saratoga Ranger, and Independence. Each carried an air wing of 90 aircraft and could generate sustained sortie rates matching 3 World War II carriers combined. During NATO exercises in 1960, Forrestal's air wing flew 147 sorties in 24 hours, including night operations. The key was aircraft availability on straight-deck carriers. Maintainers struggled because the deck was constantly cycling between launch and recovery. On Forrestal, the forward deck part became a stable maintenance area where crews could fix aircraft, while operations continued around them. The doctrinal shift was profound. Before angled decks, carrier groups stayed far from threats. To recover aircraft between strikes, Forrestal and her sisters could operate closer to enemies because they could defend themselves while attacking launching fighters, while recovering strike aircraft, while fueling the next wave. Vice Admiral John McCain Jr. called it rolling thunder capability in a 1961 brief, and he meant it literally. The carrier became a platform for continuous, uninterrupted air power projection in a way that had never existed before. One innovation, one geometry change created a weapon system that would dominate naval warfare for the next 50 years. Walk onto any carrier deck, today Nimitz class. Ford class doesn't matter, and you're standing on the same basic geometry that Boone painted on Midway in 1951. The 8-degree angle landing area is still there. The bow catapults are still positioned the same way. The optical landing system still sits port side of the angled deck. 74 years later, nobody's found a better solution because the solution was right the first time. That almost never happens in military technology. The USS Gerald R. Ford, commissioned in 2017 as the most advanced carrier ever built, costs $13 billion and includes electromagnetic catapults, advanced arresting gear, and a nuclear reactor that'll run for 50 years without refueling. But her flight deck 8-degree angled landing area, same as Forrestal. In 1955, the Ford can launch and recover 33% more sorties than Nimitz-class carriers. But that's not because someone reinvented the deck geometry. It's because electromagnetic catapults cycle faster and the crew needs less time between launches. The fundamental layout that enables simultaneous operations hasn't changed because it doesn't need to change. The physics still work. Modern carrier operations run on a tempo that would have seemed impossible to World War II admirals. During Operation Inherent Resolve against ISIS in 2016, USS Dwight D. Eisenhower maintained 75 sorties per day for 7 consecutive months. The air wing flew 12,000 combat missions without a single operational loss due to deck cycles or recovery problems pilots launched, knowing the deck would be ready when they returned. Same confidence Antietam's pilots had over Korea in 1953. The angled deck eliminated an entire category of fear from carrier aviation. But here's what really demonstrates the innovation's staying power. Every other Navy copied it. When China built the Liaoning and Shandong carriers, they included angled decks. India's Vikram has an angled deck. Even the smaller amphibious assault ships like America-class and Queen Elizabeth-class, which use vertical landing jets that don't technically need angled decks, still incorporate the geometry because it improves deck flow and aircraft handling. The design principle transcended the specific problem it was meant to solve and became the universal standard for any ship operating fixed-wing aircraft. The innovation also outlasted the technology it was designed for. Boone was thinking about jet aircraft in 1951, but the angled deck works just as well for the F-35C fifth-generation stealth fighters operating today, or whatever unmanned combat aircraft the Navy fields in 2040. The geometry isn't tied to a specific aircraft type. It's tied to the fundamental physics of landing something with forward momentum on a moving platform. As long as carriers exist and aircraft need runways, you'll need the angled deck. There's something almost elegant about how a simple geometric change 8 degrees of angle solved a problem that admirals thought would require completely new ships or revolutionary technology. No exotic materials, no computers, no advanced engineering that only 3 countries can manufacture. Just rotate the landing area and suddenly everything works. Commander Boone probably didn't realize he was designing the standard layout for the next century of naval aviation. He was just trying to keep pilots alive and make carriers more useful. But that's often how the best innovations work. Solve the immediate problem really well, and you accidentally build something that lasts forever. Stand on a carrier deck in 2025, and you're standing on a piece of 1951, thinking that nobody's improved because nobody's needed to. The angled deck doubled carrier striking power, eliminated the deadliest failure mode in naval aviation, and created the platform for 70 years of American naval dominance. Not bad for some paint and geometry.